De Tocqueville was a French nobleman who wrote a book called Democracy in America, often considered to be the greatest book ever written about our democracy, even though in some ways it's not really a book about America at all. He came to America in 1831. He spent 9 months touring the United States, from the east to what was then the great western outpost of Michigan, and then sailing down the Mississippi River to Baton Rouge and New Orleans before finally being called home for reasons we've never quite been able to figure out, and racing back to France after his 9-month journey. When he got there, he wrote this book, Democracy in America. And when I'm teaching Democracy in America to students, as I have on many occasions, the first thing I ask them is, well, so what's this book about? And 9 times out of 10, I get a very cooperative student who will raise their hand and answer, oh, this is a book about America. Which gives the professor the opportunity to say, no, it's not, just look at the title. It's about democracy. Democracy in America. What Tocqueville was interested in was, first of all, democracy, which for him meant a place in which all the citizens were considered to be created equal. When you walk out on the street every day, and you see all the kinds of people you meet, you assume they are all your equals. For most of human history, that was not the way it worked. For most of human history, you saw your inferiors, you saw your superiors. Usually there were a lot more superiors than there were inferiors. You saw very few people who were on the same level as you. Democracy is a place where we consider all of us to be equal, one with another. And one of the things he was doing in America was seeing America was the place where, as far as he was concerned, people were more equal than anywhere else in the world. And this was the way the world was going to go. One of the things he tried to figure out was what was specifically American and what was specifically democratic. And how was it that the Americans had managed to preserve freedom under the circumstances that would soon be the circumstances of the entire world, a democratic world in the future. And when he looked around at this, he saw the Constitution as really one of the great anchors of American freedom. Because he was indeed a lawyer, he spoke to lots of lawyers, in particular lots of the great constitutional experts of the time. He read the Federalist Papers. Those of you who've seen the movie Hamilton or the play will recognize Hamilton is one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. These were originally newspaper articles written to convince Americans to ratify the Constitution, which was a very tough battle, by the way. And the more Tocqueville read, the more he was impressed. In fact, he wrote in Democracy in America, talking about the Constitutional Convention, if ever America was capable of rising for a few moments to the high level of glory that the proud imagination of its inhabitants would like constantly to show us, it was at this supreme moment. You can see he got a little bit tired from time to time of Americans telling the foreign tourist how wonderful America was. But when it came to the Constitution, he thought America deserved all the praise that Americans could ever possibly say of it. And indeed, he wrote, the Constitution was written by the best minds and most noble characters that had ever appeared in the New World. So I'm going to be talking about 2 aspects of this that Tocqueville wrote about. One about American lawyers, and one about American law, and in particular about the American Supreme Court, which Tocqueville thought a really remarkable institution and terribly important in all kinds of ways. When he wrote about the lawyers, this was really about lawyers in democratic societies everywhere. When he wrote about the American Constitution, he was figuring out what made America in particular work in the way that it did. And one of the first things he realized when he came to the United States was that American lawyers, by and large, were a pretty conservative bunch. This might not shock you, or maybe it does, but it certainly surprised Tocqueville, because in Europe, lawyers were revolutionaries. The French Revolution had been made by lawyers. So, for that matter, had the American Revolution. But every revolutionary movement in Europe, every secret society, every little group wanting to overthrow the government, they were always run by lawyers. When he gets to the United States, he discovers, well, American lawyers may have made the revolution, but now in the 1830s, they don't want a revolution. They want to make society run properly, follow the rules, obey the Constitution. And he wondered, why? Why is it that in America, lawyers make society work, and in Europe, lawyers are trying to overthrow society? Well, according to Mr. Tocqueville, there are two kinds of aristocrat that are natural even in the most democratic, egalitarian society. One are the bureaucrats, and the other are the lawyers. According to Tocqueville, bureaucrats are always a bad idea. The more free a people is, he says, the more power it takes away from government officials and gives to the people and to the courts. Lawyers, on the other hand, might be good ideas. What's so great about lawyers? After all, Shakespeare thought that the first thing we should do after the revolution is kill them all. And lots of people love to hate lawyers. This is easy for me to say because I'm not a lawyer. So why does he like them so much? Why does Tocqueville like them so much? Because they're different. They are, in a certain way, the aristocrats of our kind of society, and we need them. Tocqueville writes, if I were asked where I see the aristocracy in America, I would answer without hesitation that I do not find it among the rich, who share no common bond. The American aristocracy congregates in the courtroom, at the bar, or on the bench. The thing is, unlike real aristocrats, no one's born a lawyer. You have to go to school. You have to become a lawyer. It's by education and by training that you become a man or woman of the law. And so in that way, they're different, they're aristocratic, but they also come from us, from the society. And lawyers are trained to believe in stability. They hate arbitrary rules. They hate arbitrary decisions. And if they're American lawyers, unlike European lawyers for all kinds of reasons, they're trained, or at least they used to be trained, to believe in precedent, to put reality over theory, not to try to draw out some logical conclusion which will lead us to some radical new end, but to essentially make things work the way they have worked, the way they're supposed to work. And democratic people trust lawyers because we're used to the idea that a lawyer is someone you hire to advocate for you, which is what we want our elected officials to do. The people we elect are supposed to advocate for the views which we elected them to advocate for. They too are, in a democratic society, in some sense, acting like lawyers. And for Tocqueville, the reason European lawyers were revolutionaries instead of the proper advocates of a stable, rule-governed, law-abiding society was because they didn't get their proper influence. They were pushed aside by the bureaucrats, by the king, by the government. Whereas in America, since lawyers got to run things, they're a conservative force. Or at least they used to be a conservative force. Not so much perhaps today, as my predecessor, John Eastman, may have been many things in many people's eyes, quite different things, but one thing he wasn't was a force for conservatism in the sense of stability. We live in America where instead of playing the role as those who help us preserve a free society, we have on all sides lawyers who are playing a different kind of role. No longer a conservative force, but a radical force. You may like the radicalism, you may not, but that's not what Tocqueville saw as the role of law in a democratic society. In order to be useful, it's this moderating role that law and lawyers need to play. It's a terribly important role for Tocqueville. It's so useful, Tocqueville thinks, that no republic can survive today unless the influence of lawyers on its affairs increases as the power of the people grows. Lawyers and the people are not supposed to be opposite forces for Tocqueville. They're supposed to work together. For various reasons, perhaps, that's not working so well. And to look for some of those reasons, we have to turn from this general view of lawyers in democratic society that Tocqueville has towards his view of something he sees as especially American: the American judicial system and the American Constitution. As he writes in Democracy in America, "In my eyes, the constitution of the judicial power forms the newest and most original portion of the entire political system of America." Unquote. And the judicial system is, for Tocqueville, he says, one of the three most important things preserving the American Republic. I won't bother listing the other two because Tocqueville lists the numbers. It's kind of a bit vague. Right after he gives us this list of three, he talks about a fourth thing that's terribly important too. When he gives you a number, it just means he thinks it's important. So Tocqueville thinks the American judicial system is terribly important. Why? Because it's the courts and the Constitution that serve as the only real check in the United States, or at least one of the most important checks, on the tyranny of the majority. It's the Constitution that prevents our elected representatives from doing whatever they please to our rights, because it actually gives us legal and enforceable rights that the court can enforce regardless of what law has been passed. The American Supreme Court, at the very top, can declare laws unconstitutional. In Tocqueville's time, there was not a single country in the world where anything like this was the case. It's a great American innovation. And it's an innovation intended to protect the minorities whose rights legislatures might well otherwise choose to completely ignore. Which minorities? The one Tocqueville has most in mind is probably not the one you have most in mind when you hear the word minority. For Tocqueville, the minority that a court system is created to protect is the wealthy. Quote, "The real advantage of democratic government is not to guarantee the interests of all, as has sometimes been claimed, but only to protect those of the majority. In the United States, where the poor man governs, the rich have always to fear that he will abuse his power against them." Tocqueville has in mind that although property rights are valuable to the poor as well as the rich, sometimes the poor tend to forget that. And we need courts to protect property rights and all other kinds of rights that we have as members of a minority against a potentially tyrannical majority. And the way that happens is when the court says, this law that your legislature has passed is unconstitutional. No, we can't kill all the redheads, as obnoxious as redheaded people usually are. Well, we are going to have to treat them equally like all other kinds of people. And the result, he says, and this is really very perceptive, and at the time no one, I think, had really figured it out, and even now it's not often stated. He says, there is hardly any political question in the United States that sooner or later does not turn into a judicial question. At some point, no matter what contentious issue we think of, somebody takes it to court. And the court has to decide, is it constitutional to do this or not to do this? Whatever the issue. And Tocqueville says, this would not work anywhere else but in the United States. Why? Because in most countries, and at the time this is the case, they may have a constitution, but their constitution is permanent. It's fixed forever. If you can't change the Constitution, and you have a judge that says, this is what the Constitution says, and the judge declares a law unconstitutional, you're giving too much power to the judiciary. What makes the American Constitution work is the process of amendment. The Constitution in America can slow democracy. It does not stop it, because we can change our Constitution. At least that's the theory. In practice, as we have seen, particularly in the past 50 years, it's become increasingly difficult, near impossible, to change the American Constitution. A few years ago, there was a radio interview which involved the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the late Justice Anthony Scalia. And this was a moment where, for all that Justice Ginsburg has been sainted by the American left, Scalia really showed that he was by far the more profound thinker. They were both asked the same question. If you could make one change in the American Constitution, what would it be? And Justice Ginsburg, not too surprisingly, said, I would include the Equal Rights Amendment. Justice Scalia said something very different and, in my view, much more profound. He said, we should make it easier to amend the Constitution. It ought to be hard, he said, but right now, it's too hard. As you probably know, to amend the Constitution, you need a 2/3 majority of both the House and the Senate, and then a 3/4 majority of the states within 10 years. This makes it very, very hard. If you look back on recent history as to when we last actually amended the American Constitution, I'll give you 2 dates. One is 1992, when an amendment left over from 1789, which had never quite got the number of states necessary to ratify it, and since it predated the business about 10 years, it didn't matter, it was 200 years old, that amendment finally passed, essentially trivial. The pay increase that Congress votes has to wait till the next Congress to take it to effect. That might be a good thing, but it's not really earth-shatteringly important. The last time we seriously amended the American Constitution, 1971. That's over 50 years ago. That was the amendment to allow 18-year-olds to vote in all American states. That's why Justice Scalia was saying it's become too hard. He didn't say how he would suggest for it to be changed. It might not have really been his role as a member of the Supreme Court to propose such a change, but it's too hard. And when people talk, as they have said, I think quite rightly, over the past 30, 40 years, about too much power being given to the courts, including the power of constitutional judgment, we see it as too hard precisely because the democratic role in the amendment process has become so difficult. It used to work better. It used to, in fact, work fairly quickly. In 1895, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not impose an income tax. Congress passed an income tax amendment in 1909. In 1913, it was ratified, and since then, we've had a federal income tax. That's relatively quick work. People saw a need for an income tax. Within roughly a decade, they could change the Constitution to deal with it. Not right away, not in a year, not in 2 years. The Constitution is supposed to slow things down, make us think about them, make us sure this is really a need and not a passing momentary nightmare. By comparison, Germany has a constitution they wrote in 1949. In some ways, their amendment process, just like ours. 2/3 majority, they are equivalent of a House of Representatives and a Senate, but no process of ratification by the state. Since 1949, the Germans have managed to change their constitution 62 times. Almost once a year. In fact, they don't change it every year. Every 5 years they make several changes. That might be a little bit too fast, but it nevertheless shows that it's possible to have a system with a working constitution, a German Supreme Court that regularly rules German laws unconstitutional, that can move a little bit faster than ours does, and that can bring the necessary democratic element back into the judicial system. Now, to go back to my hero, St. Alexis de Toqueville, there are two ways, he says, to make your judicial system more democratic. One, you can start electing judges. Tocqueville thinks this would be absolutely catastrophic. He hates the idea of an elected judiciary. When he came to America, he didn't know this ever existed, because it didn't exist in Europe and essentially does not exist now. He comes to America, people tell him, well, actually, in certain states, you do elect judges. And Tocqueville is appalled. And he writes, sooner or later, these innovations will have harmful results, and that one day you will see that by diminishing the independence of the magistrates in this way, you have attacked not only the judicial power, but also the democratic republic itself. The other way of making judicial power more democratic is indeed constitutional amendment, he says. Making it easier, not easy, but easier to change the Constitution would mean that we could still prevent hasty, hysterical laws that violate our rights from taking effect, while making sure that we could preserve a democratic Constitution. Let me go back for a moment to the courts and the Constitution that we have, as Tocqueville saw them. Tocqueville had, in some ways, a different worry than we did. He was worried that federal judges would be a little bit too reluctant to use their power, faced by the power that state governments held. Indeed, in Tocqueville's view, the purpose of a strong federal judiciary was to prevent the encroachment of state authority on what was supposed to be federal authority. Tocqueville's very strong on both the states and the federal government protecting our freedoms. And in fact, he sees what he wants to see is a sort of balanced competition between the two, in which freedom ends up being the winner. If you go back and you actually read the Federalist Papers, this is something that very much concerned the founders. They were concerned both for too much power being exercised by the federal government, as well as too much tyranny being exercised by individual state governments over their citizens. After all, it was the state governments that imposed slavery, not the federal government. And he wanted both of these in competition to be an instrument for increasing the freedom of the individual. When one tried to take it away, the other would preserve it. Now, Tocqueville recognizes that the Constitution is very vague about the limits of the power of the federal judiciary, and that there are a lot of good excuses in it for federal courts reaching out and taking power. And that's why he comes to think about the U.S. Supreme Court in particular as the key institution. And he writes about it when, after examining the organization of the Supreme Court in detail, you come to consider all of the attributions that it has been given, you easily discover that never has a more immense judicial power been constituted among any people. But he goes on. He says, their power is immense, but it is a power of opinion. They are omnipotent as long as the people consent to obey the law. They can do nothing once the people scorn the law. Now, the power of opinion is the most difficult one to exercise because it is impossible to know its limits exactly. Often, it is as dangerous to fall short as to go beyond these limits. The Supreme Court is, in fact, not just a judicial institution. It is in this way a political institution. It must be responsive to opinion, otherwise it will be incapable of doing its job. And therefore, he says, the justices of the Supreme Court, of course they have to be good judges, but, quote, they must also be statesmen. They must know how to discern the spirit of the times, to brave the obstacles that can be overcome, and to change the direction when the current threatens to carry away with them the sovereignty of the Union and the obedience due its laws. If imprudent or corrupt men ever came to compose the Supreme Court, the Confederation would have to fear anarchy or civil war. And of course, we've had this experience of what happens when imprudent men come to compose the majority of the US Supreme Court. This is what happened when the Dred Scott decision in 1857 sanctified slavery, said black people could never, under any circumstances, be citizens of the United States of America, and set us on an inevitable path to the Civil War that broke out 4 years later. If you have a Supreme Court that tries to fight public opinion, tries to take a contested issue and establish one extreme view of it as the only possible view of it, what you are going to get is not just a weakening of the Supreme Court's authority, but a weakening, indeed, the potential destruction of the American Republic. In a democratic republic, Tocqueville says, a Supreme Court is absolutely necessary, but, and I'm quoting again, as for me, I would never advise any people to leave to the courts the care of guaranteeing its liberty. I would be afraid that the courts would sacrifice it to the executive or to themselves. When the Supreme Court is full of imprudent people, they sacrifice the democracy on the altar of their own power. That's when democracy is truly in danger. We need a constitution, according to Tocqueville, and according to your much less authoritative speaker, for the checks and balances it provides. We need to have a Supreme Court to make those decisions, to interpret the Constitution. But we need a check and balance on the Constitution and its interpreters, a democratic check and balance. And ultimately, that is the power of amendment. Because without it, every momentary imprudence on the part of our judiciary and the part of our Supreme Court threatens us with catastrophe. So, if I can do something to summarize Tocqueville's views here in conclusion, as I recognize that my time is running short. To be free, we need lawyers, strange as that may seem. We need a constitution. We need a Supreme Court. But we can never rely on the courts alone to be free. And the courts can never rely on the law alone in their most important judgments. The court, the Supreme Court from Tocqueville's perspective, must be, to quote Justice Scalia again, the courts need to be faint-hearted. They cannot be imprudent. It's too dangerous. What Tocqueville called an imprudent judiciary risks catastrophe. There's a Latin motto that is sometimes quoted with admiration, which Tocqueville would have hated had it been around in his day. was actually only invented in the early 20th century. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. That is exactly the way to destroy the republic. You need courts, you need lawyers, not to administer one set of individuals' ideas of the principles of justice, because that is going to lead you to catastrophic imprudence. What we need is a Supreme Court that will moderate our worst influences, not pour kerosene on fires. We need lawyers to balance democracy from inside, to give us the stability, the rules, the laws that we need to live our lives, to have the freedom that we want to preserve. We need a Supreme Court that balances democracy from the outside, but that is itself subject to the democratic checks of an amendment process. We need moderation from our judiciary. We need common sense from our judiciary. What we don't need is one different majority from another attempting to make a revolution that nobody elected them to make and that nobody really wants them to make. At least nobody with any degree of prudence wants them to make. Tocqueville is telling us about the merits of our Constitution as a document to keep freedom alive, and about the need for a judiciary and a Supreme Court to keep freedom alive, and that the path to do this is a democratic path that will lead us to a moderate freedom, which is the only freedom we can ever possess, because letting the heavens fall is never going to lead us to freedom, no matter whose idea of justice that might embody. So on that moderate note, I will end my little discussion of Tocqueville, and of course I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you very much. You're going to?
I'll take a mic around to anybody who's got a question.
Like this?
Yes.
Okay, a couple of things. One, I saw that you only once referred to our country, our government, as a democratic republic. You kept calling it a democratic country, which I think is a little bit different. Second, as I understand it in the work I've done with trying to do a convention of states across the country, that our Constitution was meant to make the power be at the lowest level possible, at the state level, as opposed to the federal level. And I would like for you to address that as well, please.
Well, to answer the first question very briefly, there's nothing particularly intentional about my not using the phrase democratic republic as opposed to. We can debate that. In terms of the notion of where power is meant to be, I think if you're a careful reader of the Federalist Papers, you will see that Madison distrusted everyone's power, right? He distrusted the lower level as much as he distrusted the upper level. And that what our Constitution is in fact set up to do is that by letting all kinds of factions, including different levels of government, compete and balance and limit one another, that's how we would be able to preserve freedom. That he did not, in fact, just as he did not want the federal government to ride roughshod over the power of the states, so he did not want to allow the states to ride roughshod over the freedoms of the people and the individuals who composed him. And he saw the federal government as a means very much of checking the states, just as he saw the states as a means of checking the federal government. So I'm very wary of those who want to give all power to their favorite level of government, whether it be direct referenda by the people, whether it be the government by the states, or whether it be the national government. And I think both here I'm taking in terms of the constitutional theory of Madison, as well as the views of Tocqueville. They saw this very much as a dynamic process in which it would be entirely too dangerous to give any one force too much power. It's power that's dangerous no matter who exercises it, even the people.
But the point that I wanted to make, or
Point that I wanted to hear you make is that the federal government is run, the power of the federal government is defined by the Constitution. So anything that's in the Constitution that is assigned to the federal government is good, but only by amendment can they take away powers from the state governments.
I think that's true.
yes. But I think they're trying.
Yeah, I was interested in Tocqueville's thoughts on religion in society. You didn't address that, and maybe that's too big of a talk.
Well, I think it's a wonderful question. It's such a wonderful question that I actually wrote a book about it. It's called Tocqueville, Democracy and Religion. And to put that in a real nutshell, Tocqueville, like for that matter James Madison and the other founders, thought that it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to preserve freedom without some kind of religious basis. And that one of the ways in which he envied America as opposed to France was he thought that in America, everybody, all the parties, left, right, and center, they all endorsed this notion. Whereas French politics, that was not the case. And like I said, I've written a book about this. I could go on at great length. But yes, for Tocqueville, religion is foundational to freedom. Note, not necessarily any particular religion. Remember, Tocqueville is a Catholic. He's coming to the United States, to a majority Protestant country, and he's writing for a French Catholic audience. One of the things he's trying to persuade them is, contrary to what some people may tell you, Catholicism is perfectly compatible with freedom. And American Catholics all think this, and I'm trying to persuade French Catholics that this is true. This is not an easy case to make at the time. Would not have been an easy case to make even with a lot of American Protestants who thought that Catholicism was incompatible with freedom. But Tocqueville is sure in any case that if you want to have a free society, one of those checks and balances on the power of government, it can't all be in the laws. It has to be elsewhere as well. And one of the most important places to find those checks and balances is in people's religious faiths, whatever they may be. There are a couple other ways you can get it. He's fond of poetry. But for most people, he says, it's religious faith that's going to provide those checks and balances.
Hello.
Sorry.
I wonder if you could comment. You made a very important point about the people and the will of the people influencing the judges, and the judges having to listen to the current issues of the day and what the people are saying. What was Tocqueville's point of view about the revolution then? Because the French people and their will was very different, and as we know, things went very much awry after the revolution. He also thought there was something extraordinary about the American will and the American people. Can you speak to that difference, the cultural difference, and what made the people different?
Yes, people have written books about this too, but to be as brief as I can, Tocqueville says that the American people are the best educated people in the world. He doesn't mean in reading and writing. although that may have been the case too. He certainly doesn't mean it in terms of higher education, where very, very few Americans had ever had any kind of higher education in 1831. He says that the great superiority of the American people over the French people, and to some extent this is still true today, is Yule. Is the fact that this is a private group, a private association that gets together and creates this thing, Constitution Week. And people create it, you all come. Americans are used to organizing themselves in all kinds of associations, running these associations most of the time without coming to blows, although I read on the back of my menu yesterday that in 18 whatever there was a shootout about who was going to be the capital of the county. But most of the time, Americans manage to get through these kinds of questions in an ordinary, stable way, because we all grow up joining these organizations, helping make these organizations run, etc. Whereas in France, people are used to there being, there's the government and there's me. There's the ministry in Paris and there's me. And there's not much in between it. There's not this great associational life. And if there is an associational life, it's purely private. It's not about the Constitution. It's not about politics. And this is the kind of association that really matters. Let me give you a contemporary example, even though I'm not necessarily, sympathetic to the individual cause. There was a fight in some little town in Oklahoma. The school board had decided to make certain regulations about mask wearing, COVID, and so on. And some of the local people didn't like those regulations. And there was a school board meeting in 2 weeks. And within 2 weeks, several hundred people had gotten themselves together and presented themselves at the school board and made their views heard. Now, regardless of whether or not you agree with those views, it doesn't matter. That is American democracy in action. That is association in action. That is a way of, and they didn't go and throw bombs at the school board, and they didn't, engage in violent action. They followed the rules and so on and so forth. And that, Tocqueville says, is the kind of political education, which is why the American Revolution didn't immediately disintegrate into chaos like the French Revolution did. And that is something that is extremely important that American society maintain. And despite various, gloomy people, of whom there are lots in the United States on both the left and right, I think American society has in fact maintained that, and that example in Oklahoma was a great case. It could have been, the other way around. It could have been a bunch of people mobilizing for, Black Lives Matter under similar circumstances. Either way, from Tocqueville's point of view, that's great. And that's the strength of both the American Republic and the American democracy.
Other questions?
Did he ever address our natural rights?
Tocqueville, like most people in the 19th century, including in the United States, barely mentions natural rights. It's a thing that is really big at a certain point in 18th century discussions and disappears for the next 125 years as something that mostly got you into trouble when you talked about them. As in, the French Revolution was really big on natural rights, and see where that got them. So it seemed like an excellent idea to, instead of talking about natural rights, let's talk about other kinds of things instead. So, no, Tocqueville says just about nothing about natural rights, and it's very intentional. The only times he ever mentions Rousseau is to say, I'm not like this guy.
Other questions? Any hands I'm not seeing? I'll ask my question while I walk over there. I understand that Brazil has an elected Supreme Court, and it's become pretty dictatorial. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think Tocqueville was right. I think electing judges is a terrible idea. And Brazil, I mean, I don't know of any other country besides Brazil that has an elected Supreme Court. Most countries think that, except perhaps at the very lowest levels, there are some countries that elect the sort of justice of the peace kind of person. Electing that level of judge, there are a fair number of places that do it, not just in America, but throughout the world. But electing anything higher than that on the judicial level, to the best of my knowledge, and it's by no means encyclopedic, but to the best of my knowledge, the only place that ever happens is some parts of the United States.
Aaron, I have two questions. First, on your topic, do you think Tocqueville was just an observer, reporter on democracy, or do you think his work actually impacted and changed how democracy is viewed in America? And then number two, you mentioned John Eastman. Can you tell us a little bit about the Benson Center and the purpose of your visiting scholar program that you are right now this year?
Certainly right away, Americans saw this book, and some liked it and some didn't, but they all thought, this is this incredibly important book that this foreigner has written about us, and we should read it and pay attention to it, and it's far better than anything else that's ever been written. That's more or less been the opinion down to today. To the extent to which has it actually changed America, or for that matter, changed France, which is what Tocqueville as a patriotic French person really cared about, it certainly did not change France in the ways he wanted it to. France ended up as another dictatorship a few years later on under the Emperor Napoleon III. Tocqueville gets very depressed, leaves politics, and is gloomy for the rest of his life, which doesn't last much longer. Does it affect American politics? Well, between President Eisenhower all the way through President Obama, every American president quoted Tocqueville in his inaugural address. That doesn't mean it influenced their policy, but at least, we use the rhetoric, we use the language. It's, read any article in Newsweek about American politics, pretty good chance you got a Tocqueville quotation in there. So it's at least affected our rhetoric and our understanding. Our policy, I'm not so sure how you try to figure that out. The Benson Center, I'm delighted to talk about the Benson Center. The Benson Center was founded, forgive me for not having the exact date, but about 10, 15 years ago. Basically as an attempt to preserve is the wrong word, but to encourage a certain level of ideological diversity on the campus of the University of Colorado at Boulder, which, like most American university campuses, there's not a whole lot of ideological diversity. Or rather, there is. There's 29 different flavors of left-wing chocolate. Not a whole lot of conservative vanilla to be found. Which is why when you ask any person on the left, is the American university diverse? They say yes. I argue with all my different kinds of Marxist friends all the time. Or what have you. And in a certain sense, of course, that's true. That is diversity. The Benson Center was an attempt to make sure there was some other kinds of opinions presented, both in coursework and in general university life. So my own role as a visiting professor, both has been to teach a certain number of classes, but also to invite speakers. So, for example, last year I ran a speaker series on capitalism and ethics, which did not act as if those two were opposites, but instead act as if there was some kind of speakers who would talk about the positive relationship between those two things. That's not a point of view that otherwise would ever be presented at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Perhaps I exaggerate, but not much. So this has been the role of the Benson Center, to bring in a whole variety of people, we're 1 year visiting appointments as a general rule. I've stayed on an extra semester because of some unusual circumstances. And the success has been variable. But the fact that it exists, I think, is important. And, you know, look, I had a colleague at University of Colorado who will remain nameless, and who's a pretty open-minded guy, but who has a certain kind of naivety born of having lived his whole life in the university environment, the American university environment. And he said to me, I don't understand why we need a Benson Center. After all, we don't have, you know, something on the other side, so that's not really balanced. And I said, well, you do recognize that the word critical has become a synonym for left-wing ideas in American academia. He says yes. And I said, just how many centers for the critical study of X do we have at the University of Colorado at Boulder? He said, okay, I guess we do need some balance. Now notice, he said, okay, I guess we do need some balance. It's not as if he was against this. It's that it simply had never occurred to him. And that is the situation that is unfortunately often the case. I could tell lots of stories to this effect, but this is why one needs a Benson Center, and why I think the Benson Center, for all its various ups and downs, I don't regard my predecessor's tenure there as one of its ups, has nevertheless played a very useful role, and I think can continue to play a useful role. And I would hope that there would be more such places in more universities, just as I hope there are more Constitution Weeks in more places in the time to come.
Where are you from? What university are you from?
Okay. I teach at the Université de Paris-Saclay, to correct the pronunciation a little bit. So I teach at a suburban Parisian university. I have for the past 15 years. Before that, I taught at Florida International, which is the state university located in Miami. So I taught in America for roughly 15 years, then I've been teaching in France for 15 years, and now I'm back here, going back to France in December.
Do you prefer France?
Well, I mean, I've chosen to live there. So, you know, France and America are both great countries, but there's only one country where I can debate with just about anybody the merits of the 15 different kinds of lettuce we have at the market. And this is deeply important to me. So, also, fresh croissant in the morning, you know, just can't get them anywhere else.
Other questions? Well, if none, thank you very much, Professor Kahan. As we heard this, we will have you back.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for all your questions.